Podcast. My name is Tyler Bublitz, and welcome back to the third Sunday of Easter for the week of April 19th, 2026. I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited to begin this week's podcast, and I am excited. Here we are continuing that Easter season. I think this is something that, in my opinion, we don't talk about enough. We don't talk about enough the 6 weeks of Easter in and of itself. We do all this stuff for Lent, but then it's like we get to Easter and we forget about this. And I feel like this is an important thing that we need to be talking about. We need to be looking at. We need to be recognizing and extending that celebration. It is the highest holiday within the church year. We should be celebrating it that way. We should be acknowledging it that way. We are Easter people, and we should be looking at it and recognizing it that way. And that is part of what makes this so exciting to be in and part of this part of the church year. And so make sure that you are spending some time recognizing that, acknowledging that, because it is really important for us as Easter people to make sure that we are celebrating this. But before we jump into this week, let's look back to the question that we had for last week, which was, where has God drastically changed your life in a moment's notice, and what happened? And we had some amazing stories come through this week. It was super awesome to see. We've had ones where people being called to different churches. We had stories of people, how they were being called to suddenly take care of a loved one. We had stories talking about the impact of having these moments where they're feeling God's presence right there with them as they're taking just these moments of time. Being able to recognize the Basilica of Rome was one of them, talking about going and spending time there and acknowledging the altar and the amount of time and work and effort to be able to do that and feeling the presence of God within that place. Amazing examples to be able to have us acknowledge and think about our faith in a new and different way. And I think that's so important. And I think that's one of the things that I have been trying to do for years with this podcast. We have to be acknowledging and working on consistently that our understanding of what faith is, our understanding of what God looks like, how God interacts with us is ever evolving, because our faith should be ever evolving. And as we talked about last week, our brain is ever evolving. So let's make sure that we're constantly doing that. And it's not that we're changing God. It's that our understanding of who God is changing. So let's just jump into it this week. The first reading then is out of Acts chapter 2, starting at verse 14a and 36 through 41. This continues that sermon that we were having last week with Peter, and that's the 14a, is acknowledging that Peter is standing up and acknowledging this large crowd of people. Then it shifts. What happens here is the people have heard what is going on and recognizing what has happened. And so then they're kind of like, what do we do? We crucified this man. We crucified the Christ. What do we do? And this is where Peter then is talking about, specifically starting in verse 38, repent and be baptized. And then taking that on, receiving the Holy Spirit, and then living out the faith, making this change within us, that we are moving forward with what we have obtained. We acknowledge what God has done, and thus we are then moving forward with that. We are changing how we would have otherwise reacted or interacted because of this change. We have to acknowledge who God is and what that means for us and live that out consistently. The psalm that goes with that then is Psalm 116, verses 1 to 4, and then 12 through 19. And this is this longing that we have, starting in 1 through 4, of calling out to God and knowing that God is hearing us as we are going through the hardships of life, but then also realizing that it is God who is the one, starting in like verse 12 and 13, that gets our cup to overflow, that gets us to be able to be in this praise state. And in doing that, that means, like when we're looking at verse 16, that we are a servant and we are acknowledging that God is in control, that we are sacrificing things of ourselves to recognize what God is doing in our midst and giving praise to that. The second reading this week then is out of 1 Peter, starting in chapter 1 with verse 17 through 23. And this then is recognizing that we as people are born with the lacking. We're going to fall short of the goals of who God has made us to be. And we will fall short. It's not a question of if, it's when we fall short. And this recognition then of what Christ did for us on our behalf, and Christ's dying and crucifixion and resurrection was on our behalf. And so thus, when we are acknowledging that and recognizing that and thinking about that we then need to continue to live that out, share that love, and continue to make sure that that is a part of our character, continuing to show this is who we are. This is a part of how we are characterized as people because of what Christ has done and revolutionized how we see life because of it. This changes everything. This gives us hope. This gives us the trust in God. This is the purification of us through an act of love that is so deep that we can't fully grasp and understand it. The gospel text this week then is out of Luke chapter 24, verses 13 to 35. Now, this was one of the alternative readings on Easter, but we're really digging into this text. This is the story of the road to Emmaus. So there's two men who are walking to Emmaus from Jerusalem. And while there, Jesus appears among them, but they do not recognize him. And Jesus starts asking questions. And these men are very confused, kind of like, where have you been? Have you not been hearing what's been going on in Jerusalem? And so they lay out how they thought this was the Messiah that had been promised. And we had all these ideas of who this person was, at least this mighty prophet. And he was handed over and crucified. And we're just kind of figuring out what's going on. We've heard some rumors that some of the women and some other people potentially saw him this morning, but we don't know what to believe. And they're just kind of confused. And so there's this discussion and back and forth on what are you looking for? What are we needing to find? And what are they truly desiring in this movement through as they're trying to figure out what is going on? So they get to the city. Jesus is going to part from them, but they invite him. No, come, have dinner with us. It's late. And so when he does, he takes the bread, he blesses it, and he breaks it in front of them. And at that moment, they recognize who they have been talking to, and he vanishes from their sight. And then they start questioning, were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening up the scriptures to us? They run back to Jerusalem, tell the other 11 what has happened. The Lord has risen. He has appeared to us just like he appeared to Simon, and tells them what had all happened, that they acknowledge and really saw it on the breaking of the bread, and that he was with them on the road. So, before we jump into how faith and science come together this week, we'll do our shameless plug for Working Preacher. If you haven't checked out Working Preacher, I'd highly recommend it between their Sermon Brainwaves podcasts, their commentaries, their discussions. Since I'm not an ordained minister, I use them on a weekly basis to help give me some ideas, direction, ways to be looking at these texts, going through the different commentaries, going through different podcasts on how are they thinking about and looking at these texts. It's an amazing resource. So if you haven't checked out workingpreacher.org, I'd highly recommend it. It's worth some time to help prepare you for this upcoming Sunday by going through some of the stuff that's over there. But I also highly recommend checking out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library. I really enjoy how they lay out the text week to week, and I use that on a weekly basis myself. But along with having the art, prayers, hymns, liturgical colors, daily readings to get you into the text and get you prepared for the upcoming Sunday. Again, we are people that are trying to prepare for Sunday. Whether you are in the pews or in front of the pews, you need to be doing this prep work so that we are able to get more out of the service. So make sure that you are doing that holy work. So I'd highly recommend checking out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library. I think it's a great resource to help prepare you for the upcoming Sunday. Finally, I'd also highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication. This is either a weekly reflection going through ecological echoes, implications, and urgencies to be brought into the weekly lectionary preaching, similar to like what I'm doing week after week. So like kind of a commentary, homily way of looking at these texts week after week with more of an environmental focus. Along with, they also come out with a monthly newsletter going through different events, resources, some green notes, and I'd highly recommend checking those out. Those will be the first links down in my show notes to check out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publications. It's a great resource, an amazing place to be. Make sure that you spend some time checking those out. Well, it wasn't quite that the people were blinded by the light, but in certain ways they were blinded. What are we actually getting at here with the story of the road to Emmaus? What is actually going on? And I think in certain ways, we have to acknowledge and think about that this shows our human condition better than a lot of the other texts, in my opinion. This gets us to the heart of what it means to be in the faith and recognizing the steps and processes that sometimes it takes to get there. And I know that sounds very ambiguous, very broad, very open, but let me walk you through this and let's talk about it a little bit, because I think it starts to show us that we need to be going through this road to Emmaus type of story within ourselves consistently. Because I think when we do that, we're able to then start uncovering things on where God is trying to steer us. So we have these two men that are walking to Emmaus and are having a conversation about what is going on in their neck of the woods, their part of the world at the time, and trying to process it. And we talked about that last week, how the neuroplasticity and how we are at times still needing to process things. It takes time. So we see that aspect here early on with these men walking and talking about what is going on. But yet, we still also have this aspect that Jesus appears to them, and in that, they don't recognize him. And yet, then they have this trigger moment at the end of the text that suddenly everything wakes up. Suddenly, everything is revealed. Suddenly, they are able to understand what is going on. One of the things recently that has come up in my science feeds that I thought was really interesting is an AAV gene therapy that is working with the OTOF gene in our body. And most of us probably have no idea what that is, but the OTOF gene is what is making it possible for you to listen to this podcast right now. The OTOF gene creates autopherolin, which is the protein that makes an electrical signal for when you are hearing something come in and then sending it down your audio nerve to the brain to be able to interpret and hear what is going on. What we have found is that most people who are deaf have all the structures and everything there to be able to hear. The thing that they are missing is this OTOF gene. So they are not producing the autopherolin protein to be able to send the electrical signals. And this is where then we get cochlear implants to be able to help try to bypass the system. But the hard thing is essentially their whole system is ready to go. It is working. It just doesn't have this one protein. So what we have been experimenting with, and it's in early trials, but again, early trials are showing really optimistic views here. They were able to take 10 different people between the ages of 1.5 and 23.9 years old in China, and being able to give them a newt virus that isn't going to do anything and break this OTOF gene down. It's actually quite long, so they had to split it in two and put it in, and then they are injecting it into the spot where it needs to be within the ear. The body naturally reattaches them, and now with that gene there, it starts producing this autopherolin protein, and what they are noticing is suddenly, for the first time in these people's lives, they are starting to hear. Now, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, but it's also significant progress of what we are seeing. We are seeing where before what they were hearing was about at 106 decibels they were averaging out to, which is around the volume of a chainsaw, was when they would start to hear. And after this, in about 6 to 12 months when they were doing their follow-ups, they were hearing at 50 decibels, which is your typical conversation. with a person is around 50 decibels. Significant improvement. Now, granted, there's still long-term studies that need to be happening, and it's also still, with that being the threshold, we know there's a lot of other things that are lower than that, but this is worth acknowledging because this is a huge improvement. To be able to go from hearing at extremely loud volumes to be able to have normal conversations with people and be able to hear that is significant. And what was missing? The missing link was protein. So we needed to get the gene there to be able to produce the protein, thus being able to start having this protein be present and allowing then, as the hairs with inside your ear start moving, that these proteins then are transferring that into electrical signals for the brain to start learning. And again, this is part of that neuroplasticity that we talked about again last week, that it takes some time for their brains to start understanding that now I am getting auditory signals and being able to interpret that and understand that and do something with that is quite impressive. Let's go back then to the gospel text. These men have heard rumors about things, but again, are struggling with processing everything that has been going on. Just like, even though these people get this shot with the gene there and it starts producing the protein that it needs, it's not like it's instantaneous that they start hearing. It takes time for that protein to be able to build up. It takes time for the brain to be able to understand what is going on and that it can start to trust its ears again. That it is going to start getting signals there and actually be able to do something with those. We see that then with these men, that it took them some time to recognize what had happened. But I also would argue, when we start looking at what are we talking about here in the Acts reading, in the First Peter reading, and even to some extent in the Psalm this week, it's us continuing to reiterate now that what Christ did for us allows for this interaction to have already happened. We have already received the shot to be able to start to hear. We have already had this process to be able to bring us closer together to God. In theory, it's not like we're physically getting this shot, but I'm seeing metaphorically. That has already been taken care of. It's that the process now that we're in is that we need to learn what that means and then take action from it. We have that process where the brain needs to learn what is going on to be able to receive these electrical signals, and what does that mean, and how does this work, and what am I understanding because of this? That's one step. But just because you can now hear does not mean that's the answer to everything. That is the step to, okay, cool, you can now hear. What are you going to do with that? How is your life changed? How are you going to change how you are doing things because now you can hear? Because Christ has been risen and has brought us closer to God and that our sins are forgiven. Peter is trying to bring this up multiple times in both the Acts reading and in 1 Peter. What are we doing with this? How is this changing us? How is this moving the needle for us? We can do all these amazing things in science, but if you're never able to get to the place where you can trust what you're hearing with what we have been able to work on here for these people who have difficulty hearing, it doesn't mean any good. If they can't get to an acceptance point of I can trust what I am hearing, science can never help you with that. Within our faith, we have to be able to acknowledge and recognize that, yes, conceptually, this is what this means, but then what do we do with that information? And that's where we get into like legacy within our lives. This word separates us within our own faith, being able to take that information and then run with it and do something with it. It's the old adage of you can bring a horse to water, but you can't force it to drink. These men that we see on the road to Emmaus recognize, see what happens, and what their action is we need to go and tell the disciples that this is not a fluke. We have seen this now as well. And the mounting evidence of what God is doing is then being shown. And then we get this flash forward here in the Acts text of we have recognized, we have seen the Messiah, we acknowledge that this has happened. And what is Peter recognizing? You're sitting in this moment of, I feel bad, I feel terrible, we crucified Christ. That's great. That's a great acknowledgement. That's a first step of what you need to do. But also then recognize the grace and forgiveness that God has given you, and what are you going to do because of that? Personally, for me, I feel like there's a lot of times that I've watched people with their faith, they can do the acknowledgement conceptually of what Christ did. The thing that for me that I have a hard time with at times, and it's one of the things that I continue to wrestle with myself, is because I am stating that this is true, how does this change how I move forward? That is the thing that I think is really important and very difficult and very hard, but it also, I would argue, is where God truly meets us. If we look at these patients, we understood that they were not hearing well. We understood then over time that it's because of this protein. We figured out ways to be able to do this. But again, it gets to a point where the patient has to figure out that this is what is happening and accept it. And then because of that acceptance, what are they going to do differently because of it? As we are in this Easter season, that is a big part of this. And again, this gets back to my opening comments on why I feel it is so important for us to be acknowledging this Easter season and living out this Easter season. Because if we are going to acknowledge the resurrection of Christ, this also means that then we need to live differently because of that. To say that we are acknowledging the resurrection of Christ and to do nothing differently, to me means we either don't conceptually understand fully what this was, or we're just being quite selfish. Because if this really is life-changing stuff within us, and we're not able to take the action to be able to change how we are living because of this, we have missed the point of the resurrection in and of itself. We have missed the point of what Christ was trying to do with the love that was trying to be shown. Christ was coming in and trying to help us get closer to God in a way that we couldn't otherwise be. These patients who are born without the OTOF gene, it's very difficult for them to hear. We're trying to come in as some of the science that's being done to be able to help them with that. What they do with that is the question. If you've grown around sports, I feel like this is a great example also in and of itself. They talk about this all the time. You can have all the talent in the world, but what you do with it is how you'll be defined as an athlete long after your playing days are done. Having talent and living up to and utilizing that talent is different things. And this gets back into the gifts that we have been given. Christ has made it so that here is your gift, and I'm giving you direct access to God, and I'm helping you bridge that gap so that you can live into that as good as you can. I'm eliminating barriers for you. Are we going to then go and do it? That is the question. Christ eliminated barriers for us. Just as these scientists are eliminating barriers for these particular people with hearing, what are they going to do with their lives after that is a question that they have to answer. That's their part of the equation. That's our part of the equation with faith. What are we going to do with this? In the story of the road to Emmaus, we see them go and tell to be able to continue to build that evidence and gather together to figure out what are we going to do next. And most likely, these men then were continued to be part of the disciples and were probably in that room as Peter then is giving that speech in Acts and building this faith that we are still part of today. They are the part of the foundation of what we are building upon today. So how are we going to do that now? Are we going to accept this information and take this information and do something with this information? Or are we going to ignore it, challenge it, question it? And there is a time and a place for that, don't get me wrong. But it's also at what point do we start trusting what we are quote unquote hearing, quote unquote seeing, putting the pieces together. So the question I have for you this week is, where have you lived into your talent? And where do you still need to grow in that? Where have you lived into your talent? And where do you still need to grow into your talent? I know for me, there's been different seasons of my life, different things I've done, different careers that I've worked in. And there's things that I look back and said, now with experience, now with life experience, I would have done that a little differently. I was still working on and developing who I was and figuring things out. But then there's other parts of me that I look at and it's like, this has been consistent for decades. This is part of who I am. This is me living into who God created me to be. And I think that's an important self-evaluation that we need to be doing on a consistent basis. If we aren't doing that, it's like going and getting treated to be able to hear and then we don't do anything with it. Christ broke down these barriers. Then we need to be able to utilize the gifts as these obstacles aren't there. One final example I'll use before we close it for the week. I was recently just thinking about this podcast in and of itself. And there's been plenty of weirdness, and maybe this is part of when I'm getting closer and closer to 450. Maybe this is part of what I need to talk about. There's plenty of reasons that I could have not done it. There was plenty of reasons on things why I shouldn't do it. There was cost reasons, there were who's going to listen reasons, there was experience reasons, there was do I have the right degrees reasons. But then there's also the aspect of when do you just do something? When do you just do something because this is where you're feeling that God is calling you into and that you just figure it out with God's help? And I'll say this, and I'll get into it further some other time. When I'm looking at my metrics on my side, this has already been the craziest year that I have ever had with this podcast, and we're barely beginning month 4 of this podcast. It's bananas. But for me, it's also the aspect of that was never the purpose. The purpose was, yes, to try to connect and talk about faith and science and trying to get some people to be able to interact with this, and that's awesome. But what I've also found along the way is it's as much been a deepening of my own faith. I'm forcing myself every week to sit down and to go through these texts and continue to see how God brings life into them. And for me, that's that aspect of continuing to utilize the gifts and talents of what God has given me and being able to share that with others, you on the other end of the microphone. So for me, it's an honor that I'm able to do this week after week and being able to find unique ways that we can have a conversation looking at these texts week after week. So we'll wrap this up as we always do. I pray God blesses you through your faith and amazes you through science.